Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the news items we have for you this week, an alternative to Ozempic with fewer side effects, but also protein-based. Ancient diseases are coming back in the USA, and, well, we can thank a number of people for that. Fat tissues could be malfunctioning, leading to difficulties in weight loss. And cockroach cyborgs. Egg shortages are not surprising, but also avoidable. Lightening changes its behavior after changes to the operation of shipping lanes. The National Cancer Institute has supposedly been instructed to avoid publishing anything without approval if it relates to certain topics. And Curiosity is breaking open rocks on Mars like cracking eggs and discovering curiosities. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. We'll start with drug discovery and the idea that a drug could theoretically be useful. Understand, we're talking here about effectively a analog or comparable product to Ozempic, and it's a similar sort of protein. The difference is that unlike glucagon-like peptide-1 agonists, which are basically Ozempic, Wegovy, and similar, this is a slightly different product, but it basically does the same thing. You have basically two peptides, and each of them take a different route, but have the same end result when it comes to glucagon-like peptides. In this case, rather than being a specific glucagon-like peptide, this instead goes to the brain and targets particular neurons there. So the end result is the same, that is, you don't feel like eating as much, but it doesn't work quite the same way as glucagon does. Where this gets not only interesting, let's say, but rather questionable, if not somewhat controversial, is that the peptide was identified using an AI-based drug discovery program called Peptide Predictor. Basically, it looks through a whole bunch of different proteins and tries to figure out how you can possibly use them in different ways. Now, by doing this, you are taking a very crude, at least in historical terms, and very inefficient approach, again in historical terms, and trying to find if there's one thing out of all of these that could do something. It's how bioprospecting used to work. You throw enough shit at the wall, eventually something will stick. Well, that's what they found here. The advantage of this particular molecule, called the BRP molecule, is that it's very small. It's only 12 amino acids or residues long. Things like insulin and similar are much bigger. This is especially important in this context because we're talking about something that has to get into the brain. This means it has to pass through the blood-brain barrier, and that's pretty resistant to most everything out there. Even a lot of the more lipid-soluble drugs have trouble getting through the blood-brain barrier. And so, this small-sized peptide is incredibly useful in that respect. Now, animal testing has shown promise, but it is animal testing in obese and otherwise normal weight mice, but also only over a relatively short period, so it's not yet proven that it's doing much of anything reliably in humans, and this will be the big catch. In long-term studies, we have long-lived people, and the fact that those who are elderly appear to have notable differences in their body genome and similar. Now, depending on where you're in the world and what you're looking at, this could be things like, say, diet, lifestyle, just plain old genetics, and all sorts of other things. And so we have one particular study from Geoscience which found biomarkers, these are things like cholesterol and glucose, that are particularly important. Unlike a lot of other studies, this is looking purely at blood-based testing, so that's particularly useful. After all, if you can look at something just based on a simple blood test, you have a much better chance of being able to basically go, this is going to be a good predictor of you living a longer life. Not necessarily a long life, but a longer. So what they found was that in order to get to at least 100, you're going to have to look at things like your glucose levels, creatine and uric acid. Once you hit 60, and that seems to be the point at which these become relevant. Before that, well, honestly speaking, you have a much higher chance of dying from something like, say, cancer, drink driving, angry partners, stress from work or family. There's all sorts of ways in which you can die well before 60 that aren't necessarily as reliable. One of the curious markers, at least in our opinion, is iron. Having lower levels of iron appears to have ramifications in terms of your ability to survive much longer. Surviving long term may not necessarily be a good thing, mostly because those who live long enough live to see things that they thought gone away come back. This includes tuberculosis. Unfortunately, tuberculosis has been spreading in America. Bloody hell. It's been measles, it's been bird flu, and now it's TB. It's just one thing after another, and sadly we can't exactly blame Trump for everything at the minute. That would be a nice easy out, because you'd be able to say RFK Jr. is responsible, but no. So far there have been 147 people who've been diagnosed with TB, and a very large number of them have been in Kansas. Roughly 80 or so. Now, TB is nasty, for one simple reason. It is very hard to treat and it spreads relatively easily. Between these two things, people get it and it doesn't go away, at least not for a while. One of the things that makes TB hard to treat is that it's got a nice little waxy coating on it. That means medication takes a very long time to get through that waxy coating and into the tuberculosis organism, mostly Mycobacterium tuberculosis. And so, it's very hard and takes a very long time to treat. While people are being treated, they may also be contagious, which is also not a good thing. There was a long-running attempt to stop TB from spreading, and it was fairly successful, all things said and done. It admittedly didn't go perfectly, but it was relatively successful. And then people became stupid and decided, no, let's just do dumb shit and cause it to spread again, because the evil you don't know is the evil you don't care about, or in other instances, complacency spreads contempt. Particularly when it comes to medical advances. There's a certain irony in this video in that on the 24th of March, it's World TB Day, and it's celebrated on that day because that's when the physician Robert Koch managed to identify TB and show what it was, or at least discover it in a way that was more useful than just saying there's a disease that spreads. The spreading of it is relatively straightforward. It's the same way most respiratory diseases spread. Basically the emission of various respiratory droplets such as coughing, singing, yelling, and so on and so forth. But you can also spread it other ways, and these other ways are perhaps more, let's say, nefarious. Unpasteurized dairy products are one particularly pronounced option, and given the resurgence of unpasteurized products, well, you can imagine. There's also a certain concern, particularly when we talk about the American scenario at the moment, where it's more affecting the low-income communities, and, well, at least two have died from it, but why we mention it's particularly important in low-income communities in America is, well, they're either going to have one of two options. Go broke getting medical care and probably have to declare bankruptcy, or suffer and eventually die if they suffer for long enough. Now, whether they die of old age or from TB is up for debate. The big concern we have beyond the fact that TB is spreading again is that TB's already had two drugs specifically developed to treat it. Now, these were in the early 40s and then into the 50s. The problem is that each time TB became resistant and basically almost immune in some respects to these antibiotic treatments. And so now we have to rely on 2 and even 4 drugs at a time to deal with it, which is really not good. And oftentimes, that treatment using 2, if not 4 antibiotics needs 6 months and sometimes more again. So it's a long time frame, very strong antibiotics, and if you unfortunately stop it, you have a good chance of having trouble. Yeah. You can imagine that this is a shit show in the making, and seeing TB again is something that many people would view as nightmarish and hellish, and something that they never wish to see again. In the same way soldiers might perhaps look at their experience in war and go, I never want to see war again, nor see a war started again. Except living with TB and living with people who have had TB or have TB is, in some respects, not necessarily worse, but similar. Next we have just when it is you get treatment, it could have an effect on when it is and how well you recover, specifically surgery. And by when, we're actually talking about on a much shorter scale than you might think. It's actually, if you have surgery at the end of a week, you're more likely to die, or have complications, so either way, it's not a good thing. Now, this is United States and Canadian research, so take it with some salt, because there are various issues to do with US data and Canadian data, but the results are at least somewhat indicative given the size of it. It was about 430,000 surgeries, so it's not an insignificant number. What they found was that by Friday, exhaustion, fatigue, and everything else really does set in for the people doing these surgeries, and unfortunately, it shows in the data. Well, it shows in the mortality data. For now, we'll skip over the issues around complications. They're a related but slightly more complex issue. The data is also not just isolated to a small time frame. It's over 12 years, so it's not like this is a 1-year scenario where you look at it and go, that was a bad year. No, this seems to be consistent throughout years. One upshot to all of this is that this pattern doesn't apply to emergency surgery. So for example, if you have a car accident, in the case of America, you can get shot at school. If you're in Europe, acid attacks or knife attacks. If you're in Australia, attacked by some sort of animal, plant or insect. If you're in any other part of the world, whatever it happens to be, well, you're not less likely to have issues because, well, the surgery doesn't get delayed. It's an emergency surgery. But for every other scenario, it seems to be true that the pattern applies. That is, surgery at the end of the week, much higher chance of dying and complications. Surgery at the start of the week, much lower chance, or at least relatively speaking. The data that they used for this did indicate one possible explanation, although this explanation has some issues with it, but for now we'll just go with it. That is, surgeons working on a Friday seem to have less experience compared to working the rest of the week, and particularly on a Monday. The exact difference appears to be around 3 years' time, so for some reason, if you work a Friday as a surgeon, you seem to be less experienced, and that may be why there's a higher mortality rate and higher complication rate. Whether or not this actually applies is somewhat more questionable, but in theory, it might prove to be useful to know, either because you're really optimistic about getting the best possible outcome, or you're concerned about the worst possible outcome. Next we have the ramifications of trying to lose weight and being obese. And there is some questions around whether or not, the inability or difficulty in losing weight could be down to the way certain adipose tissue or fat tissues don't work quite so well and sometimes malfunction. At least in theory, the human body takes a simple approach of build up fat for when you don't have access to food readily. For example, famines, bad crop yields, or in the modern world, just being a broke university student. And so you can use up that fat, at least to some extent. However, for some people, despite that being a very obvious, a very direct and very simple thing, it just doesn't work that way. Their body does not lose weight, despite being under the right conditions for that to happen. The data is based mostly on Canadian research again, or at least Canadian data, which could prove helpful. But again, we need to look at this with a certain amount of skepticism. Mostly because it seems that a lot of research into obesity and losing weight and similar has some pretty serious flaws to it. Not necessarily flaws that completely undermine everything, but certainly make it more difficult to extrapolate out research beyond the particular study you're looking at. Admittedly, this isn't a new topic for us. We've touched on this before, wherein we've explained, essentially, the fatter you are, the harder it is to lose weight. For some reason, the body seems to take the view of the more fat your body has, the more it wants to keep that fat for when things go wrong, despite you trying to lose it, which is, in some respects, ironic. One way this happens is, the body has an issue around how it communicates. Once you develop a certain level of, let's say, obesity, although not quite that. It's a very broad description for now. This then has effects on things like the liver, the muscles, and the ability to produce, or at least respond to, insulin. And so you see how the problem of losing weight, being obese, and all the other factors becomes very intertwined very quickly and becomes almost a Gordian knot. This is why, to a certain extent, it's true that deposition of fat across your body, or at least your body type when it comes to fat deposition, has ramifications for your risk of not only being able to lose the weight, but your risk of other complications, for example, diabetes, atherosclerosis, and certain other problems with metabolism. Now, we do want to be explicit about this, and we very much disagree with the authors of the article from the conversation in that Yes, obesity and weight loss should go hand in hand, and no, it's true that not everybody can lose weight the same way as effectively, but there's a big difference between saying that there's an underlying pathophysiological mechanism and saying people shouldn't be able to lose weight. You should be able to control weight to some extent. Now, whether or not you need extra support in doing so is a different matter, but losing weight in and of itself should be feasible. It's a matter of how you go about it. But that is going to vary very much by individual. It's not something where you can say there is one solution. This is why there are 101 different forms of diet out there, and probably many more again, and why there are just as many different ways to lose weight with medication, supplements, and so on. Moving on to microbiology now, we have how it is that bacteria, in a weird way, seem to be rather philanthropic in their death cries. Not quite. It's basically when bacteria die, they seem to undergo a process of apoptosis that leaves all their gooey innards, essentially their inheritance, to all the other bacterial cells in the area around them. It's not really the same way human inheritance works, but it is somewhat similar in that the insides of bacteria are full of all sorts of useful things, whether it is the nuclear material that is what makes up DNA, whether it's the amino acids, unused proteins, sugars, and so on, all sorts of stuff inside the bacteria that can be useful for other bacteria to survive and grow. This is why, at least according to Durham University research, E. coli are doing exactly that. Now, they were using imaging techniques, statistical analysis, and bacterial growth measurements to be able to say this, so you need to be a little bit skeptical about it, but it does indicate, at least somewhat, that they're correct. It's not like this is a, let's say, a completely foreign or novel concept. It is something that's used in other applications, particularly when we're looking at, say, analyzing cells in a cell culture, whether you're looking at, say, histological sections from pathologies or whatever else it is. There are all sorts of ways that they can use this sort of image technique and statistical analysis, along with other things, to find results that are meaningful. It's just that they seem to be relying very heavily on one particular form of analyses or one particular form of, let's say, analytical method to be able to get this particular result. So it definitely needs to be proved other ways, preferably methods that aren't so, let's say, lopsided. From a purely evolutionary point of view, though, it makes perfect sense. After all, if you have a species, or at least a subset of a species, that will make the progeny it creates, in this case daughter cells from, say, a bacterium that splits into two, have a better chance of going on to continue surviving by committing apoptosis and essentially providing all of its goods to the offspring, it's going to continue to spread because they always get a leg up once the previous generation passes. Whereas if you don't, well, obviously they're not going to have the same advantage and therefore won't be able to procreate or at least spread anywhere near as quickly. Shifting on to weird sort of environmental, animal, in this case entomology, and technology news, we have cockroaches made into cyborgs. Yeah, this is sounding rather disturbing and dystopian, but what they've done is attach small little computers along with lithium batteries onto the back of cockroaches and be able to send them on their way. This is Japanese research, if you didn't already tell. Sadly, this is not the cool kind of cyborgs. This is the creepy, weird kind of cyborgs, which, in Japanese research, kind of goes hand in hand. What the, let's say, cyborg does is they use these small cockroaches, because they are small and very able to travel, to get into places that are otherwise inaccessible. And they can encourage the cockroach using the implant, let's call it, by giving them small electric nudges in the right direction. The way they do it is by, well, strapping electrodes onto the cockroach antennae, along with the small processor and the battery pack. Yeah, it sounds really weird and really uncanny, but it does work. The combination of essentially computer and living organism allows for the researchers to get the cockroaches to travel somewhere while avoiding all of the necessary roadblocks, hassles, and hazards that are between it and its objective. This means that they can explore, understand, and respond to changing environments. For example, if you have, say, a landslide and you need to get small animals, or in this case insects, into somewhere to see if there are any living people trapped under rubble. Well, this would work. Of course, it would also be creepy if you were to do anything more nefarious with it, for example, strapping explosives to them, designing them to be literal bugs when you're trying to do surveillance. And of course, the fact that, well, we now have creepy insect-computer hybrid cyborg things. It really does get rather uncomfortable once you're thinking about the further ramifications. In slightly more uncomfortable animal-related news, although this time actual animal news, printed penises for pigs to solve their erection issues. Now, sadly, unlike humans, you can't just give a pig Viagra, or buy them a sports car and give them several $100s to find entertainment. Instead, pigs experience a trauma, let's say, and their trauma leads to a drastic drop in the ability to reproduce. They go from almost every time they're going to have sex to having offspring until about 25% of the time, which, well, that's pretty significant if you're looking at this on the scale of, say, pig farming. Losing 3/4 of your production of pigs to, penis trauma is not ideal. So the implant is modelled on the corpus cavernosum. That's the spongy tissue of the penis. The implant helps solve the issue of, penis erections and the fact that there's a defect preventing it from happening. This research, let's call it, is a collaborative effort between China, the US, and Japan, which, yeah, this sounds a little bit uncanny, let's say. The reason why the research is hard, though, is not so much that it's actually a problem in and of itself. Rather, the issue is how do you execute it? And the problem we say with that is that there's going to be a fair amount of pressure in the makeshift corpus cavernosum using, blood to get that erection. And so you need to find a way to build something, let's say, that will allow for the pressure to be coped with, but when it's not a high-pressure environment, and not be a problem. And this is where a hydrogel that creates a structure is used. The hydrogel itself is basically the scaffolding, and then within that, they add pig and or rabbit endothelial cells, which allow for the creation of the necessary biological elements. And this creates the vessel-rich tissue, and that in turn leads to the implantable device, let's call it, being, not only biological, but functional. It's kind of amazing just how much time, effort, and research goes into figuring out how to make penises work, and if they're working already, work better. It's just one of those things that, science has this weird fascination with, or more likely to be industry, because, in this case, males have a very strong market share when it comes to paying for things related to this anyway. Next we have news that's animal related, but related specifically to the ability to produce chicken eggs and eggs as a whole. The simple reality is that at present we have solutions to the avian influenza outbreak. Now, how viable they are, how effective they are, and certainly how much they cost are a big question, but we do have viable solutions. For example, the very easy solution would be just vaccinate all of the chickens, ducks, and so on that are currently used to produce eggs. That would be a relatively straightforward solution, and it would certainly prevent the need to, cull more than 166 million chickens in the USA and nearly 300 million worldwide. So certainly from a ethical point of view, it's certainly better to give the chicken a particular vaccine shot once, at least once a year, and then go on your way. Because we're not doing that, for example, the cost of eggs and chicken costs as a meat product have skyrocketed, and it's simply because there aren't enough chickens available. If you don't have a chicken, you can't get an egg, and if you can't get a chicken, you also can't get the meat from it. Now, theoretically, you could get old laying chickens and turn them into meat chickens, but they're not particularly good eating. So this is basically a catch-22. You can't cull them, and thereby slow down or ideally stop the spread of avian influenza, if you want to have production. And of course, we've mentioned ducks as an example, but turkeys, geese, there are plenty of other avian species that are used as food that are also in the same general category, wherein they're costing more and there's less of it available if we're looking at it in terms of eggs, meat, or anything else. As the genetic literacy project goes through, there are a number of candidates as to how we could get around this. They go through the previously mentioned idea of vaccines, but even genetic modification or genetic engineering is another way we could do it. There are ways to make, particularly domestic birds, more resistant to things like avian influenza that just aren't being used, and part of that is people being silly, but also part of it is, do we actually have the research there now to put it into practice? And even if we do put it into practice, will it be permitted? And there are a lot of issues around animal species, and the ability to genetically engineer them to make them more, resistant to various diseases. In similar news, although this time looking purely at plants, we have the ability to make supersized tomatoes in particular, but other species in the same general category as well, because we've now analyzed the blueprint for their entire genome. And with this and various genetic engineering technologies like CRISPR, we can make big changes. Now, tomatoes and similar all come under the general family of nightshade, the selenium family. And from that, you're able to make, say, bigger tomatoes, and tomatoes more resistant to diseases such as mold, things like eggplants, things like potatoes. All of these could be used as a way to stop various diseases from being a problem, but also make them more resistant to environmental changes like, say, drought, extra moist environments, things like salinity in the environment, heat waves, cold snaps, which would be a big one. All of these things are very much there and could very much be done, but, well, we couldn't before now because we didn't know the necessary information. Having the necessary background knowledge and understanding of the entire genome, we are very much now in a position to increase the productivity of every one of the nightshade family species. Shifting now to purely environmental news, we have lightening. Not lightning by itself though, it's lightening and the use of shipping lanes and how different practices have led to drastic alterations in how lightning strikes. If you look at the area around Singapore, it is essentially a hub for shipping. And what you'll notice if you plot lightning over this is that there is a weird correspondence between amount of shipping, or at least intensity of shipping, and intensity of lightning strikes. And it seems that, ships seem to draw lightning. Now, we're not talking about this in terms of the giant metal ships, that's an obvious thing, but it seems that the movement and activity of these ships lead to them emitting various particles that draw in lightning above and beyond their presence alone. The cause for this appears, at least in theory, to be sulphur, and that's mostly pretty much clear-cut, given that up until 2020 there was a gradual increase. In 2020, new regulations reduced the ability of ships to emit sulphur by 77%, and following that, lightning dropped, so seems kinda straightforward. You have a before and after, and you know what changed, for the most part. Unfortunately, the exact relationship isn't necessarily clear-cut, and that's because, although there are several theories as to how it is sulphur is contributing to lightning, the exact mechanism isn't established. What we can say as far as things that are established is, interesting case of plagiarism. Well, we call it plagiarism only because, that is what it is, but it was an article published after somebody had submitted it to a journal. It was rejected from that journal, and it seems somebody involved in that journal then submitted it elsewhere. Now, the person who did so claims it was an honest mistake. We didn't do anything wrong, we didn't mean to take someone else's work and claim it as our own work, it happened. They were similar file names, and it's one of those things. One of those things where you change all the names and details inside of it, make it clear that it's your work and not the work of the person who originally made it. Yeah, and the sad part here is that, the person who was essentially stolen from found out because they were given notification that there was an article published in their area of research. When they looked at that article, they thought, this is strangely familiar. Yeah. The very, very thin silver lining to all of this is that once the journal and the corresponding author were notified of this, the articles retraction process was begun. It hasn't quite been finalized yet, but it has been acted on, which, to be blunt, is a lot better than many other instances of similar sorts of things. In pure research news, rather than interesting behaviors and, let's say, publishing ethics, still publishing ethics-related news, we have the National Cancer Institute has been told that they're not to publish on things like vaccines, fluoride, autism, and similar, unless they get approval from the top-level executives. Essentially, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. You know, Robert F. Cray Cray, the guy who thinks he had a worm in his brain and that vaccines are bad. Although he denies the vaccine thing, but it's kind of hard to deny when you've been involved in the Samoa shit show. And, of course, he has various other hot takes, let's call it. There is a list of 23 items that, according to the internal communication, are not to be published until they are given a go-ahead from someone senior, which, yeah, given the topics in question, it's probably not a good idea. It's one of those things where trying to tie the hands of, Health and Human Services as a whole, but particularly the National Cancer Institute, makes it look more and more like you're acting in a way that is censoring publications related to them. And given that this is a government-based research institute, censoring them is really not a good idea. In fact, it almost looks like, activism rather than administration. The controversial or high-profile topics that are taboo are cancer moonshot, NCI budget, COVID-19, vaccines, bird flu, opioids, marijuana, dietary guidelines, obesity, stem cell or fetal tissue research, abortion, autism, peanut allergies, fluoride, measles, diversity or equity efforts, gender ideology, environmental justice, federal policies, federal investigations, issues concerning pending legislation, and topics that have received recent attention from Congress. And finally, the last one, which is more a broad catch-all, topics that have received widespread or critical media attention. Yeah, this last one is especially obvious that there's something more to this than just that they're trying to be more cautious in what they publish to the public. The effects from this may also be more significant than just within the National Cancer Institute itself. And the reason we say this is that if you are working on a project which the National Cancer Institute is, say, either funded through a grant or has some other involvement with, now you have to wonder, what can you actually tell the public about what you're doing because you're associated with, and in some cases working on the project with, the National Cancer Institute. Because of that, this could have very significant impacts on the ability to publish research, or at least to talk about it publicly prior to it being peer-reviewed and, typically published. It's a kind of bloody event, and it's not the only bloody event that'll happen. We're about to see the blood moon, a red moon, but it's a colloquialism, meaning the moon turns red. It's, a non-scientific description of the phenomena because, it's what you see. And it only occurs roughly every 2 years or thereabouts. It takes that long to occur because it does require certain conditions to be met. And for the most part, the conditions required are pretty straightforward. They're just somewhat unique. It requires that the Earth completely block the moon so that the sun's light only passes around the very outside edge of the atmosphere. This ensures that only red light can get to the moon, and then from the moon it gets reflected back to us, and that's why it turns red. The reason that occurs is because the outermost layers of the gas atmosphere are thinner, and they're made up of certain gases that are more conducive to transmission of that red light, whereas the blue light tends to get somewhat stuck in it. The final news item we have for you goes all the way out to Mars now, and it's Curiosity finding curiosities. They did so by breaking rocks and finding inside that rock yellow things, yellow material. Now, this might not seem like much, but it is kind of important. The rover's only travelled 900 kilometers so far, and this is perhaps one of the more remarkable discoveries it's had, the sulphur. Now, we're not just talking about sulphur in general terms here, we're talking about elemental sulphur. That means basically pure sulphur. And although they're common on Mars, they're not so common as a pure substance. You'll often find them mixed into other things. If it were just one such rock, it would be just what we said, a curio. But it's not just one rock. It's a valley full of these similar-looking rocks and therefore likely to be also full of elemental sulphur, which isn't a phenomena that should really happen by itself, or at least not without some other explanation to go alongside it. And so the question now becomes, what led to the deposition of all of this nearly pure sulphur in one particular area? It's very important to bear in mind that there are only a very small and very specific set of circumstances under which pure elemental sulphur can appear and at least develop like this. And the thing is, those conditions haven't been known to occur on Mars before now. Now, yeah, in theory, that would be the case. You would expect that Mars being at least somewhat like Earth, sure, it's probably going to happen, but having actual evidence of it occurring is very different to thinking it would be logical to have it occur. Further to that, well, sulphur is essential for life. This is indicative of something going on Mars that we're just not aware of yet because, well, you need these very specific circumstances and they're not going to occur in entire isolation. And the fact that we have water and other things now, things are looking more and more promising for, well, curiosity and what they might find on Mars. If it doesn't find Martians, the hope is slim, but the hope is there. That's all the news we have for you. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. And please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.